All right, I will say good morning. Good morning. Let us begin by thanking all of our sponsors for this morning share. To thank our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Sivan. Stephen Terry Zinn for dedicating all of Hashem's Roshos this month with gratitude to Hashem as they welcome their fifth grandchild, Gavriel Amichai Zinn, and in memory of Steve's mother, Doris Zinn Devora Basra Bisrael Yoel Zichron Livracha. Shadin Avram Kelman, and creation of the Yarzeit of Avram's father, Refael Yechiel Ben Avram Zichron Livracha. Our week of learning sponsors: Jeff Schwartz, a commemoration of the first yard site of his father, Shmuel Ben Shimon Halevi, Zichron Livracha, and we dedicate our learning this week in Meretz Hashem in the memory, in the schos of Tova Rabinowitz, Tova Bas Yoshua Yaakov, Zichron Livracha, sister of Chevy Friedman, and in memory of Adina Zahavi, sister of Yossi Opendin, Adina Basheva Bas Dov Ber Azriel. We hope that in the merit of these two imos, be Yisrael, that in Meretz Hashem, the mishpachas should know Yeshua's and Nechamas and Besoros Tovos, and the Meretz Hashem, the Neshama should have an Aliyah, and their families in Nechama. Well, so with that, let us begin. We have a long daf ahead of us today. So today's daf is daf Zayin. We are picking up on Vav Amud Beis, and we left off in the wide lines. 5 lines up from the bottom. I should say 5 lines up before the wide lines. Omar Ze osamake lechatzigago, beze osamasa lechatzigago. So if you remember again, we spoke about the idea that the case we left off with yesterday was the case of Reuven and Shimon living on opposite sides across from each other from the width of their sarabim. And they have rooftops that are literally right opposite each other. So the halacha is that each of them are obligated to construct a wall, a half wall, and the half walls are not opposite each other, but we'll call it perpendicular to each other. You understand? I don't know what the right technical term is. In other words, they're at opposite ends. So each are building a half wall, but effectively going ahead and obstructing the full view of one another from their rooftops. So the Gemara says as follows: So we'll say, so the Gemara says pshita. So I don't understand. So this is obvious. In other words, this seems to be the best way to go ahead and ensure that you create a hezek or you prevent hezek re'iyah. So what's the chiddush over here? The Gemara says lo tzricha. So we'll say, so the Gemara says, no. What's the chiddush? The chiddush is one that's called Ruvain went ahead and Ruvain put up his half wall first. So the Gemara says, what would you have thought? Namely, idach. So perhaps again, Shimon could say to Ruvain, shakal uzinka va'avdi es kule. So perhaps you would say like this: that maybe Shimon could say to Ruvain, listen, you already started putting up the half wall. Just finish it up. Just put up the rest. So the Gemara says, K'mash Shmolon, da'amrali at mai tamalo avarata, yishum the misra ashisach. So because the Gemara says, but Reuven can say back to Shimon, why didn't you put up the wall? You didn't put up the wall because ultimately, again, you don't want the weight of the wall to erode the weight of the Hezekriya wall to erode the wall below it. Ananami misra le'ashisa. I also don't want the wear and tear on my walls. So in other words, that Reuven can say to Shimon, although technically speaking I could build the entire wall, but again the weight of that wall will take an effect on the rest of my structure. It's not fair for me to bear the full effect of that. Instead, halacha l'maisa, we should share it. So the Gemara says as follows: Amar Rav Nachman, Amar Shmuel. So we'll say, so now this case, we actually saw this case earlier on in the Masechta. So imagine the following situation. Reuven has a gag, he has a rooftop. His rooftop is next to the chutzner of Shimon. So his roof essentially Reuven's roof looks into Shimon's chutzner. What's the halacha? Ultimately, Reuven is obligated to go ahead and erect a wall of Dalar Amos to prevent him from looking into Shimon's chutzner. Aval bin gag legag lo. But again, when let's say Reuven and Shimon, let's say they had adjacent homes with rooftops of the same height, they would not be obligated to construct a privacy wall. They would not be obligated to construct a hezek re'iyah wall in between the two rooftops. Now, take a look at Rashi. Rashi says over here, so it's the first wide line in Rashi. Gavoa arba amos yushum hezek riyah. So this is an interesting case. So now Reuven's rooftop looks into Shimon's chutzner. So therefore the halacha says that Reuven is obligated to make a hezek riyah wall of dalet amos in order that he can't look into Shimon's chutzner. Aval bein gag legag, but between one rooftop and another rooftop, you don't have to. So the Gemara says, Lo tzarich ki de'amram b'shmaitin kamaisa, chatzer kivia tashmishay, v'gag lo kivia tashmishay, v'lo yidana b'hai adna desalkis de'itztana minach. So also it's actually very interesting. So therefore, the idea is like this. The reason why when Ruvain has a rooftop that looks into Shimon's Chatzar, Ruvain has to create a Hezek Riyah wall, because the assumption that the halacha makes is as follows. A Chatzar is used regularly. A Gag is used episodically. So therefore, again, because Shimon, the owner of the Chatzar, doesn't know when Ruvain is going to be out on his rooftop, so therefore, again, it impedes Shimon's use of his Chatzar, and therefore Ruvain is obligated to put up the Hezek Re'iyah wall. This is different, again, when you have two rooftops. Because rooftops at the end of the day are now what the Gemara calls kavia tashmishe. They're used episodically. So therefore, again, when Ruvain sees Shimon out on his rooftop, Ruvain will be mindful. Shimon sees Ruvain out on his rooftop, he'll be mindful. So it's because they're both used episodically, therefore, halacha l'maisa, there's no din of a hezek re'iyah wall. Rav Nachman didei, Rav Nachman says, eino zokok l'dal ramis, aval zokok l'mechitzas asara. So this is interesting. So Rav Nachman says, you're right. In the case of two adjacent rooftops, you will not be obligated, no one's obligated to put up a hezek re'iyah wall of dalar amis, but you are obligated to put up a mechitza of 10 tfachim. Of 10 tfachim, the Gemara says, Lamai, what does a mechitza of 10 tfachim do? What does that accomplish? Ila hezek re'iyah, arba amos boinan. If it's about, let's say, preventing visual damage, then halacha l'maisa, again, you need dalar amis. Ila nitvas alav kiganov, b'misifas ba'almasagya. If it's about property demarcation, so that, if Ruvain wanders onto Shimon's rooftop, there's only one reason that he's there, and that's why, to steal something. So you could accomplish that just with a very basic boundary marker to show that this is not your property, there's no reason for you to be here. If it's to keep out animals, then Allah you just need a wall that's high enough that if the animal comes head first, it's not going to be able to get through. The olam lenitbas alav kiganov. So we'll say in reality, the point of this little wall of 10 tefachim wall is to go ahead and prevent theft. Now, not prevent theft to keep people out, but more like to prevent theft that if Ruvain is on Shimon's roof or Shimon's on Ruvain's roof, there's only one reason why they're there, and that's to steal something. So the Gemara says, why can't you accomplish that with boundary markers? So we'll say with a little boundary marker, because it's so flimsy and really insignificant, therefore halacha l'maisa, if Ruvain ends up on Shimon's rooftop, Ruvain can say, I dropped my object on your rooftop. So therefore, something so flimsy wouldn't necessarily prove an intent to steal or to damage. But when it's something more significant, that indicates that Shimon doesn't want anyone on his roof. Even if Ruvain did lose something there, he has to contact Shimon first and doesn't have a right just to wander onto the roof. If he comes onto the roof, we understand that's with an intent to steal. Very interesting. But again, once it's a mechitza of 10 tfachim, so again, Ruvain can't make any excuses for why he would be on Shimon's rooftop. Okay, so let's analyze. So therefore, I both say what the Gemara comes out with essentially is the following models. So obviously, if you have a shared chatzar, you could force a hezek re'iyah wall, right? You have a rooftop that looks into a chatzar, you could force a hezek re'iyah wall on the rooftop. Two adjoining rooftops can't force a hezek re'iyah wall, but it sounds like can go ahead and put up a mechitza of 10 tefachim. So basically, Mari is the kasha. Im haya chatzir lemala migago shel chaveiro. So this is an interesting case. If let's say Ruvain's chatzar was higher than Shimon's rooftop, so we'll say they essentially they live on a hill, if you can imagine, right? So Ruvain's chatzar is higher than Shimon's rooftop. So what's the halacha? Ein niskakin lo. Ultimately, again, we do not require him, or we do not literally attend to him. The Gemara says, "My love ein niskakin lo klal." So we'll say, that sounds like over here that we don't require any wall at all. That's how we're understanding ein niskakin lo. So again, this is chatzer lamala migago shel chaveiro. Ein niskakin lo klal. The Gemara says, "Lo ein niskakin ledal ramis aval niskakin mechitzas asar." Now we'll say in that kind of case, we won't require a full wall of dal ramis, but we'll absolutely require a mechitza of 10 tfachim. Se'itmar, the Gemara is the kasha, shtei chatzer zulam al mizu. So we'll say now another interesting case. Ruvain and Shimon are neighbors. There are two chatzeros. Now, interestingly enough, Ruvain's chatzar is higher than Shimon's chatzar. Okay? So now both say, so now watch this. Amar Rav Huna. So Amar Rav Huna. Rav Huna says as follows: Tachton bona mikenegdo v'ola, ve'elyon bona mikenegdo v'ola. So both say this is actually very interesting. So Rav Huna says like this. Now, if you think about it, there's two parts. There's really two parts to this hezek re'iyah wall. So now they want to build a hezek re'iyah wall in between the two. What are the two parts to the wall? So part one of the wall is to gap the height differential between Ruvain's chatzar and Shimon's chatzar. Part two of the wall is then the additional height. So the shaila is obviously both are going to be obligated to go ahead and pay for what we'll call the additional height. The shaila is, are they obligated to go ahead and pay for what we'll call the bridge height, right? The differential height of the wall. So Rav Huna says, Tachton bona miknegdo. No, the lower chatzar is obligated to pay for the bottom part of the wall that essentially catches him up with the taller chatzar, the higher chatzar. The elyon bona mikenegdo va'ola. So we'll take a look at Rashi. Rashi says over here, ze bona mikenegdo va'ola. Ze bona mikenegdo va'ola. Hatachton bona mishalom milamata ad shemagia legova karkiyaso shel chavero. So the lower chatzar builds his chiluk of the wall up until he gets to the point equal to the height of the higher chatzar. Va'achar kach maschil ze l'sayo. Then the guy in the higher chatzar begins to help him. V'nosin chal kol mikenegdo umala. V'lo yehe elyon nifsad b'shiflas karkiyosav shel tachton. So Rav Huna essentially says like this. So let's assume in this case Reuven has the higher chatzar, Shimon has the lower chatzar. So therefore Rav Huna says like this. So Shimon, you are obligated, it's your sole obligation to take care of what we'll call the lower part of the wall that catches you up to Reuven. That has nothing to do with Reuven. Why should Reuven have to pay with the bridge part of the chatzar, with the bridge part of the wall? Because Shimon's chatzar is lower. So Shimon pays for the lower part of the wall to, so to speak, catch him up with Reuven. And then Reuven and Shimon share in the rest of the wall. That's Rav Huna. Rav Chisda says no. He says Elyon Mesayeh Melamata Ubona. Rav Chisda says no. A wall is a wall, and what? They have to share in it. And what does it mean to share in it? To share in the entirety of the wall, both the lower part as well as the upper parts. Incredible. So Moshe says Tanya Kavasi did Rav Chisda. Supposed to hold to machlokes. So Bryce, that's the parts of Rav Chisda that they have to share in the wall in totality. Shtei chatzeros zulam al mizum. If you have two chatzeros, one is higher than the other. Lo yomer ha'elyon harini bona miknegdi va'ola ela mesayim elamata ubona. So the upper chatzar can't say, listen, I'll take care of the wall, corresponding to the ground level of my chatzar and above, but I'm not getting involved in anything else. Rather, misayeya milamata ubona. You have to be willing. In other words, we'll say a wall is a shared responsibility, and even the lower part of the wall is part of that shared responsibility as well. However, again, if halacha l'maisa, Reuven's chatzar was taller than the gag of Shimon, then ultimately, again, there's no obligation. So therefore, I will say, fundamental machlokes between Rav Huna and Rav Chisda, and the Gemara seems to support Rav Chisda that halacha l'maisa, in this case, where you have two chatzeros, one taller than the other, then halacha l'maisa, again, both parties are obligated to share in the wall, but the entirety of the wall. Both the lower part of the wall that bridges the height differential between the lower chatzar and the upper chatzar, and again, then the rest of the shared wall as well. That's how the Rambam paskins as well. That halacha l'maisa, you're obligated to go ahead and share in the wall in its entirety. Incredible. So the Gemara says as well, there's a good, beautiful Mr. Haskell in this as well, which is that sometimes in relationships, we expect people to meet us where we are, right? In other words, I'm up here, you're over here. It's your responsibility to come to me. It's not my responsibility to come to you, right? So you get up to me, then we'll build something together. The way it works in relationships is that sometimes you have to extend yourself to other people wherever they may be. And even sometimes that means that halacha l'maisa, a person has to go and get off their perch or get out of their ivory tower and go down and meet people where they are. Never spend life expecting people to meet you where you are, but instead extend yourself to meet them where they are. There's a beautiful Gemara. Actually, it's Basra. We'll see it later on. And this is the Gemara says, Isisach gutza, if your wife is short, gachin v'lachishla, bend down and whisper to her. The idea being a tremendous idea. Chassan, I want to welcome back our Chassan to Daf Yomi. Welcome back to Yoni Frager. Baruch Hashem. most beautiful and incredible and magnificent chasana. And Baruch Hashem, such an incredible and beautiful and handsome chassan and kala, and such a beautiful group of people celebrating two neshamas coming together. Yoni, on behalf of the entire shir, Mazel Tov, welcome back to shir. But this is a good, you can use this as Shever Brachas, by the way. He says, if your wife is short, bend down and whisper to her. The key to successful marriage, Chazal says, is don't expect your spouse to come to you, but rather, again, bend down. If she's short, if somebody's short and you want to have a conversation with them, there's two ways you could do it. You could tell them, hey, get a stool, get on there and come and talk to me, right? Or you could bend down and whisper to them. The key to Shalom Bayis is meet your spouse where they are. Don't expect them to come to you. Such an incredible and overwhelming yesod. We live our lives with expectations of people. This one needs to do this. Stop having expectations of people. But instead, go ahead and you bend down. You do what has to be happened. So again, it's an incredible Musar Haskell in this. Right? Reuven has the higher field and Shimon has the lower field. So Reuven could easily say, listen, Shimon, it's not my fault you have a lower field. You come up to me and then we'll build together. The halacha says no. That's not the way it works in partnerships. In partnerships, if you want to build something, you build it all together from the lowest ground up. Incredible. All right, let's go weiter. Says the Gemara. Good. Hano Beitrei was a great case over here. Last two lines. Hano Beitrei tavudayri chad havadayir iloi v'chad havadayir tasoi. So here's the case. Back actually to the end of Bava Metzia, where you have two people, Reuven and Shimon, living in a two-story home. Okay, so what happened? So the Gemara says as follows. If you actually, the way Rashi understands it over here, Rashi says in 3 lines up from the bottom, Davod Dairi Chad Eloi V'Chad Tasoi Kishacholko Achin Notel Zeh Bayis Zeh Aliyah. So Rashi understands it as two brothers. It's not a rental. It's not a rental or an owner. What it is two brothers, Reuven and Shimon. Their father Yaakov died. They inherited a piece of property. So Reuven lives on the upper level. Shimon lives on the lower level. Okay, so now what happens? I will say it's an interesting case here. So the Gemara says, Itbar Tasoi. So we'll say, so the lower level, the walls, the house, essentially, the structure began to sink into the ground. As a result, the ceiling height of the lower level was significantly diminished. So what happens? Amalei Tasoi Le'ilai, Tav v'Nivye. So again, Shimon, who lives on the lower level, says to Reuven, let's just keep it Reuven and Shimon. Right? Reuven on the lower level says to Shimon, he says, listen, we got to demolish the house and rebuild it because this is not really livable for me anymore on this lower level. Amarle, on the shapir da'irna. So Shimon says, I don't know, I'm fine. I don't need to demolish anything. My upper story is just great, and I'm sorry for what's going on with you. But at the end of the day, I'm not demolishing the house. Top of Zion. Amarle. Astiri ana va'avne. So fine. So Shimon says, listen, Reuven, I'll take care of it. I'll take care of it myself. I'll do it. We'll say Zayin and Aleph 7, 8, first line. So Reuven offers. So we'll say just to understand the different iterations of this conversation. In the first part of this conversation, so again, so Reuven was saying to Shimon, let's demolish and build it back together. Then Shimon says, I'm not interested. Reuven says, fine, I'll take care of everything. So Amarle, Leslie Duchtel. So Shimon says, okay, I don't have a place to live. Where am I going to live during construction? Amarle, Ana Ogir Lecha Duchta. So Reuven says, I'll rent for you a place. I'll rent you a house. Amarle Lo Tarichna. So Shimon says, it's a tircha. I really don't feel like moving. So the Gemara says, so Amarle Lo Tarichna. Lo Kamistali. He says, at the end of the day, I really don't feel like I should have to do anything. So I'm sorry. So Reuven says back to Shimon, what do you want from me? I can't live in that bottom level. The walls are sinking into the ground. So Shimon responds very sympathetically, Shufak Reisach va'ol v'shufak Reisach upoch. Crawl in on your stomach and then stand up. Crawl out on your stomach and then stand up. In other words, fine, so what's the big deal? Bend down a little bit when you go in, and bend down a little bit when you go out. In other words, live with it. So I'll say, so therefore, again, in this case, Shimon, the upper story guy, clearly unwilling to accommodate his brother Reuven. Amar Rav Chama, Bedina Kama Akev. Rav Chama says the truth is, Shimon's right. Shimon, the upper story brother, is right. In other words, people say, as long as, I was going to say in just a moment, well, let's see, Shimon the brother is actually right and has a right to go ahead and say, I'm not interested in demolition, in construction, in relocation. Now, all of this is assuming that the walls have not sunk to less than a height of 10 tefachim. Avamotu kishur lamata me'asar literally means the beams. But if the beams, the ceiling beams, are less than 10 tefachim off the ground, matzi amarle lamata meyud rishusa didihu v'lo meshabed lecha. Ultimately, and I will say, if the walls, this is actually interesting, if the walls sink or the ceiling sinks within 10 tefachim of the ground, we'll say, so remember again, the bottom domicile has, at least the first 10 tefachim are considered to be the airspace. If the walls sink too low, then it turns out that Shimon's upper story apartment is in Ruvain's Ruvain's airspace. And then Ruvain could be makbid. Then Ruvain could be makbid. So essentially the Gemara says something very interesting. So the Gemara says that Allah Chalamaisa, as much as it sounds like Shimon is really being a jerk, right? Really being a little bit difficult over here, but Lamaisa, he has the halachic right to do so. As long as, but the case was that the Gemara is being defined over here, the case is where Ruvain could use his lower story apartment. It's just uncomfortable but usable. So if it's uncomfortable but usable, then Shimon has the ability to go ahead and block Reuben from doing anything. Furthermore, this is where they never made any kind of agreement with each other. In other words, we'll say, this is assuming that they went into the apartment or the house and they never made any other formal agreements. Aval asnu gabe hadadi. But if Lamaisa they made agreements, in other words, let's say they stipulated structures sink over time. So let's say they went ahead and they made an agreement that should the structure sink, right? We reserve the right to deconstruct and reconstruct. Okay, so then Rabbi said, then ultimately, Sasri Ubanu. Then in that case, of course, you could deconstruct the home. In other words, then Reuven, the lower story guy, would have the right to go ahead and say, listen, we agreed on this, and therefore let's deconstruct and reconstruct. Incredible. V'chi asnu b'hadadi adadi ad kama. So we'll say, so ultimately, again, and when they go ahead and, interestingly enough, when they did stipulate with each other, so we'll say, so let's say they stipulate with each other that should the lower apartment, should the lower structure not have the requisite ceiling height, so we agreed that we're going to demolish and rebuild the home. So we'll say, what is considered to be the general, accepted ceiling height of a structure? So Rabbi Gemara says, Rumo, the height of the ceiling, kechatzi arko, kechatzi rachbo, is the equivalent to half of the length and half of the width of the living space. That's the formula. Height is half of the width and half of the length of the living space. I was saying, now where does that come from? It's actually quite beautiful. If you look at Rashi says, fourth line down from the top in Rashi, if, again, I will say it's totally different case, but let's say again, I was contracted by my friend to build a home. Osarumo, what's the general accepted ceiling heights? So Osarumo kechatzi arko v'chatzi rachbo kebinyan hahechal. This is modeled after the Beis Hamikdash. Shahaya arku abaim, right? The length was 40 amos. V'rachbo esrim, and the width was 20 amos. The gavho shloshim, and the height was 30 amos. So again, 40, 20, 60, right? Length plus width, half of that is 30. That becomes the height. I was saying, by the way, now it's quite beautiful. It's part of the beauty of that film. Remember again, which Beis Hamikdash is this referring to? Which Beis Hamikdash? This is the first, right? First Beis Hamikdash was 30 amos tall. If you remember again, how tall was the second Beis Hamikdash? So this is beautiful. This is part of the beauty of Daf Yomi, how you pick up beautiful nuggets of holy information along the way. This is the machlokes. Is it mem? Was it 40 amos, or was it a type? Right? Was it Was it meya, 100 amos, or was meya a typo? And in reality, it was 40 and mem and not meya. Okay. Either way, this is a reference to the first basic English. So this is just interesting. Which a tremendous, beautiful yisod. So what do you see from Rabbi saying? How do you figure out what is the basic ceiling height? The basic ceiling height of a regular residential home, right? Somebody contracts me to buy a home. What obligation do I have in ceiling heights? Length plus width divided by 2, right? Divided by 2. Where do I get that formula from? Nice high ceilings, right? Where do I get that formula from? Beis Hamikdash, 40 amos in length, 20 amos in width. 60 divided by 2 gives me a ceiling height determinant. So what do you see from here? That a home is a mikdash ma'at. The dimensions of a Yiddish home, the dimensions of a Jewish home, are gleaned from the Beis Hamikdash. which means that a home is not simply where you live. A home is the epicenter of your Yiddishkeit. A home is the epicenter of your spiritual growth. A home is the epicenter, ultimately, of your relationship with Baruch Hu. I will say, now I understand how careful I have to be in terms of what I allow into my home. So remember again, you weren't allowed to enter into the Beis HaMikdash in a state of tumah. That was the Gavra. Alachas kama v'kama, all the more so, you can't bring tumah into the Beis HaMikdash. Hey, how careful I have to be, what influences I allow into my home. The Beis HaMikdash, what was Beis HaMikdash? All about Achdus. Right? Beis HaMikdash is the place that ultimately brings Klal Yisrael together. What is a home about? A home is about chesed. A home is about hachnasas archim. A home is all about achdus or Klal Yisrael. It's just incredible how the dimensions of our personal homes are gleaned from the dimensions of the Beis HaMikdash. So beautiful. So the Gemara goes weiter. The Gemara says, Amar le Rabba, Lav Aminu Lechu, Lo Tislu Be Buki Suriki Rav Nachman. So this is interesting. So comes along Rabbi, and Rabbi said, how many times have I told you not to hang empty vessels on Rav Nachman? In other words, that was another way of saying that, what are you talking about? You're totally misquoting Rav Nachman. Haki Rav Nachman. This is what Rav Nachman said, Ki dairi inshi. No. So the Gemara says at the end of the day, Rav Nachman says no. The height of a ceiling has nothing to do with length plus width divided by 2. Rather, Rav Nachman went ahead and actually gave a different shear. What was his shear? In other words, how tall is a basic ceiling height? The way people live. How do people live? V'kama Amar Rav Huna B'Rav Yeshua Kiechi Da'ayli Isirisa Demechuz V'Hadar. It's enough. It's actually interesting. It's enough to go ahead and carry a stack of long reeds. And both say, so the idea over here is you have to be able to carry a stack of long reeds into your house and move in every direction. Left, right, up, down. So if you have the maneuverability with a stack of reeds, then halacha l'maisa, that's a ceiling height. That's what you need. Okay. Hahu Gavra, what's another story? Really interesting case over here. Hahu Gavra, Dahava Bani Ashisa Achuri Kavi Dechavre. Shabbos is a great case. Reuven and Shimon are neighbors, right? What does Reuven do? Reuven built a wall opposite the windows of Shimon. Okay? Amrle kama aflas alai. What are you doing? Right? So Shimon says to Reuven, Shimon says, what are you doing? You're blocking the light from my windows. Amrle sakarna lechahacha va'avdina lecha kavai le'al mishisai. So Reuven says back to Shimon, okay, I apologize. Here's what I'm going to do. Let me seal up those windows, right? And let me build you windows, higher windows above the wall level. That way you'll get your natural light. Amarle, Kamarle alashisai. So he said, if you do that, you're going to erode my wall. You're going to erode my wall. So the Gemara says, Amarle Satarna lecha lashisach. So we'll say the idea over here is what Shimon seems to be concerned about is the closing up of a wall, the closing up of the windows, the drilling or the hammering out of new windows. It weakens the wall. So Reuven says, fine, Amalei, Satarna lecha lashisach, aduchta dekavai, upanina lei va'avina lecha kavai b'minyana le'al me'eshisai. So listen to this, we'll say. Reuven says, fine, no problem, you know what I'll do? Let me lop off your wall at the point of the windows, right below the windows. I'll rebuild new wall from that point forward and install new windows. So in other words, so instead of trying to close up and install new windows in an old wall, I'll simply lop off the wall right below the current windows, rebuild up from there and install your new windows like that. Shimon says, no, I don't want that. Then I'm going to have a wall. The bottom of the wall is going to be old, and the upper part of the wall ultimately is going to be new. Now, we'll say, now the truth is, Rashi points out, see, when you read this, it sounds like, what kind of guy is Shimon? Just a difficult one. Just come on. And we'll say, now Rashi says it's not totally illegitimate. The reason it's not illegitimate is because Rashi points out over here, sometimes mortar doesn't adhere as well between newer stones and settled stones. So this is not an illegitimate claim. What Shimon is concerned about is I'm going to have an old wall on the bottom and a new wall on top that may or may not work well. Amrale, fine. Satarna lecha ad la'ara ubanina va'avina lecha kai ve'begava. So Reuven says, fine. Here's what we're going to do. I'm going to knock down the entire wall. I'll knock down the entire wall and build you an entirely new wall from ground up. That way, again, it's all new wall, and we could put the windows above the wall line. So Shimon says, no. Then I'm going to have one new wall in my house and 3 old walls. And I will say once again, while it sounds like Shimon is being difficult, Shimon does have somewhat of a taina because he's saying the mortar is not going to attach as well between old wall and new walls. Or I should say, new wall and old walls. So the Gemara says, so this is pretty wild. So Reuven says, you know what, fine, I'll just build you a new house. I was saying, obviously, Reuven is incredibly attached to this wall, right? So the nice is fine, I will just build you an entirely new house. So that's incredible. So Shimon says, thank you, but I have nowhere to live during construction. So Reuven says, I will rent you a new house. Right? I'll rent you a place to live during construction. To which ultimately, again, Shimon says, I don't really want to be bothered. I'll say, there's a profound yesod in this also. In order to be willing to help people, you have to be willing to be bothered. Right? At the end of the day, see what I say, that last line really says it all. When Shimon says, Lo tarichna, leave me alone. I'm not interested in helping. I'm not interested in being bothered. So if I'm not interested in being bothered, you could offer me a new house plus relocation expenses, which sounds like a pretty sweet deal, right? And this entire thing. But if you're not interested in being bothered, then that's going to be able to say, being part of Klal Yisrael and having a sense of achrayus means being bothered. Being bothered means being made uncomfortable in trying to help the other. So if a person has a mindset of lo tarachna, I'm just not interested in helping out, I'm just not interested in being inconvenienced, then one loses out on the incredible opportunity to be there for another in their time of need. Just an interesting yesod. It's almost as if Shimon placed his hand in that last line. At the end of the day, whatever you're going to tell me, I'm not going to accept it. You know why? I don't want to be bothered. Okay, so they come to base. But didn't come akev. The truth is, I'll say at the end of the day, so I'll say really, Shimon's right. Shimon Haraz, Reuven doesn't have a right to put up that wall in a way that blocks out the sunlight ultimately from Shimon's windows. And the truth is, whereas it's very nice that Reuven is offering all of this, Shimon doesn't have to accept. He just doesn't have to accept. Gemara says, now, this sounds like 2 of the same cases. Right? It's the same case. In other words, the 2-story house case and the window case are the same thing. Both are saying that at the end of the day, right, that ultimately the guy who is in the position of power, in case number 1, it's the upper story guy. In case number 2, it's the window guy. Both have the ability to object to the lower story guy and wall guy from doing anything. So why do you need both cases? The Gemara says, Vaha sulamali, ha kamashmalan. So we'll say, I'm sorry. Hainuach v'ha sulamali. So why do I need this additional case? We'll say first white line. Hakamashlan da afagav delo mishtamish elativna ubeitzivi ba'alma. So this is interesting. What's the chiddush over here? See, we've been assuming this entire time that how was Shimon using this structure, this home? It was where he lived. So we'll say the chiddush over here is even if this was not Shimon's primary residence, but rather what? It was just a storehouse. He still has the right to object. He still has a right to object. No one has a right to start building walls that go ahead and obstruct your natural light. See, even if it wasn't natural domicile, but a storehouse, he can still technically object. Incredible. All right, let's go back to Rashi says over here, so again, even if Shimon is not using it as a domicile, but he's using it as a storehouse, he has a right. Yeah, so I'll say, so interestingly enough, no one, the halacha can't compel you to go ahead and be matriach yourself and inconvenience yourself for someone else. Halacha can't compel you. Should you do it? Absolutely. Could halacha force you to do it? Absolutely not. Incredible. What's another story? Hano be trei achi de palik bahadi adadi. So let's listen to this. 2 brothers. They inherited an estate. So what happens? They split up the estate. Chad matye as pelida. V'chad matye tarbitza. One took a mansion and one took a garden. Clearly, we know who has the brains in the family over here, right? So one took the mansion, one took the garden. So listen to this. So the brother took the garden. We'll call him Shimon. The brother took the garden, went ahead and constructed a wall right at the entranceway of the mansion. So in other words, so he constructed a wall on his property, right opposite the mansion. Amarle, so Reuven, the owner of the mansion, said, "Kama aflis alai, you're taking away my natural light." So finally, we'll say, so again, this was opposite windows, opposite a doorway, whatever it was. He said, your wall is obstructing my natural light. Amarle, bididi kabanina. So Shimon says, leave me alone. I'm constructing this wall on my property. As long as it's on my property, you can't do anything to stop me. Amrav Chana, bidin ka amarle. The truth is, Shimon is saying good. Shimon is saying good, I will say, in a case where ultimately, again, he's building it on his own property. Again, also, we've seen this before. You can't prevent someone from doing something on their own property. Amar Ravina, Rav Ashi. So Ravina said to Rav Ashi, I don't understand. What about the following case where we learned? Shnei achin shechalku. Two brothers who split up property. Echad mehed natal sada v'kerem. So I'm sorry. Echad mehed natal sada v'kerem. Ve'echad mehed natal sada lavan. So I'm sorry. Echad mehed natal sada kerem. Ve'echad mehed natal sada lavan. So we'll say, so same case, right? Reuven and Shimon, two brothers. Father Yaakov died. They inherited the estate. One brother took a vineyard. One brother took a wheat field. So what's the halacha? Yesh lo lebala kerem dalet amos besadalav and shamanas kin chelko. So ultimately, again, the brother who has the vineyard, let's say, automatically goes ahead and has dalet amos, even into the area of the wheat field to go at a week and work his vineyard, because this was the condition with which they split. In other words, we'll say everyone knows, in order to tend to a vineyard, you need dalet amos around the vineyard to be able to tend to it. So therefore, again, understood in this division was that although one brother was getting the wheat field and one brother was getting the vineyard, the brother with the vineyard was also getting the dalet amos around his field, because it's understood that when you split something as part of inheritance, both of whatever everyone is getting, each party has to get something that is totally and fundamentally usable. So the Gemara says, so therefore I will say, so does over here. If Reuven is getting the mansion and Shimon is getting the garden, so on this I will say part of usage of a mansion is what? Light. So therefore again it would make sense that Shimon can't do anything to obstruct that. Amarle hasam da alu lahadadi. So saying, well, you could say ultimately again in the case of the wheat field and of the vineyard, they obviously worked out. They must have recreated some type of arrangement that they're each getting a like item of value. Aval hachamai, what would you say in this case? The Gemara says, alu lahadadi, where they didn't go ahead and negotiate something with each other. Vechi b'shoftani askinan, are we dealing with fools? The high shakal aspalida v'high shakal tarbitza v'lo alu lahadadi. So we'll say, so now here's what's interesting. Obviously, we'll say, the way it must work in these cases is when brothers divide up an estate, so obviously the goal is that each of them walk away with a similar item of value. So they must have somehow worked it out with each other. So in other words, if Reuven's taking the mansion and Shimon's taking the garden, b'pashtos, what else occurred over here? They probably was some type of cash payout or something, right? That Reuven probably paid Shimon something, right? So that they each walk away with a similar value from the estate. So the Gemara says over here, aspalida palgisli, hashta mashvisli in druna. So why can't Reuven say, listen, Shimon, it's not right, because I took as part of my portion the mansion. A mansion means an area that is usable and functional. Now with your wall, it's rendered the mansion as a dark room. So in other words, why can't Reuven say to Shimon, essentially, I'm not really getting my inheritance. I'm not really getting what is due to me. I'm going to say, Ashi, Shma ba'ama poligwe. Because it will say, maybe when Reuven got a mansion, he got a mansion in name only, maybe not a mansion in function. As we're both saying, we've seen this before, we're going to see it again now, that sometimes something could have an identity by name, but that identity doesn't necessarily reflect functionality. So maybe Shimon could say to Reuven, when you got the mansion, that's because that house, that structure, we called it the mansion. But lav dafka, that part of your inheritance is the actual usage of the space as a functional mansion. So the says, after all, didn't we learn? Milotanya, did we not learn? Listen to this. So base car afarni mochalacha. So listen, I watch this. Reuben says to Shimon, I'm selling you a base car. Base car is an amount of space. A base car of land. Even though it's only a lesach, which is not a base car, less than a base car, higio, the sale still works. Why? Because they'll say when he sold them a base car, what Reuven could say was, I was selling you the field that is named base car. That is named base car. But see, now you see this sometimes, like in these these larger homes, these estates. Like it's interesting. They give them names. They give them names, So sometimes properties have names. You can see it's not so far from me. You can see places, right? They have like a sign out front. It's not the family, or sometimes it's not the family name that's out there. It's not the last, but it's the name. So therefore, again, Reuven can say to Shimon, no. The name of the property is base car property. That's the name of the property. Base car is not reflective of the size. Base car is the name of the property. So even though the property is less than a base car, the sale stands. The Gemara says, that's fine, that works. V'hu demiskri base car. But say, that's true as long as what? People actually call it base car. Like in other words, as long as the shingle, in other words, Reuven says, you know what, everybody calls it base car. Nobody calls it base car. Only Reuven calls it base car. I just started calling it base car 2 minutes ago. Right? So I said, that's not going to work. But if it's known as the base car field, and Reuven sells it to Shimon, even though Shimon gets there and he measures it, and it's less than a base car, the sale is still good because, again, he sold them a name, and the name is not reflective, ultimately, of functionality. Incredible. Similarly, again, Pardes and Mochalacha. So Reuven sells Shimon an orchard. So Afapi She'in Bo Rimonim, even though there are no pomegranates, there's no fruit, Higio, the sale still works. Why? Shalom Macharlo Ela Shma. Because it will say he sold him a field that's called the Pardes, but not that the field itself is actually a Pardes. Similar to V'hu Demiskri Pardes, as long as people actually call it the orchard. Right, the orchard. Similarly, again, if Reuven says, I'm selling you a vineyard, even though there are no vines on this piece of land, the sale works. Because ultimately, again, I was selling you a piece of land called the vineyard, but lavdafka is not actually a vineyard. This all works, assuming that what people actually call it the vineyard. So the point over here is, why can't Shimon say back to Reuven, it's true you got the mansion, but the mansion is not actually reflective of the usage of the space. Rather, it's called the mansion. So because it's called the mansion, you got what you got. I'm sorry that the light is blocked out, but it's not my problem. The Rishon says, no. Amidami. Hasa matzi amarle mocher lilokeach shma zvini. Hacha matzi amarle adaita dahachi palgi dadrina bei kiechi didara avasan. So also now watch this. In the previous cases, it's different because each of these spaces, each of these areas had its own specific identity. The name was reflective of an identity as opposed to usage. Over here, Abosai, this is very interesting. When Shimon goes ahead and gets the mansion, Shimon has a right to say like this, that when we split up the property, the intention was for each of us to be able to use the property as our father used it, right? And when Father Yaakov was alive and he used the mansion, how did he use the mansion? With sunlight. With sunlight, now your wall is blocking my light and you're preventing me from using it as our father used it. Amrulay, so we'll say Amrulay. They said to him, Amrulay, we'll say, this is 7b, Amrulay Marinuka Markashisha, Braid Rav Chisda Ravashi. So we'll say Marinuka and Markashisha, who were the sons of Rav Chisda. So these were literally their names, we'll say. The young Mar and the old Mar, these were their names. Ultimately, again, sons of Rav Chisda. So Tosas points out over here something interesting about their names. We're not going to go through it right now. So they said ultimately again to Rav Ashi, Nardoy Tamayu. The Nardoim go according to their reasoning. I will say, take a look at Rashi, tap Rashi on the daf. Nardoy Tamayu. Rav Chamba de Min Nardo, who to those spherale, had the either be kidaru avase ulashem kachilaknu azla tamayu de Nardoy de Amr Shmuel. Listen to this. So now, we're kind of veering a little bit, but it's not a tangent because it's actually part of this topic, which is, when you inherit property, does inheritance of the property come along with the ability to use it as the now deceased owner used it? Right? In other words, does inheritance come with the ability to utilize the property in the same way that the deceased owner used it? So here we go. Amar Rav Nachman, Amar Shmuel, ha'achin shechalku ein lahen lo derech zeh. So we'll say brothers, so let's say Reuven, Shimon, Levi, their father Yaakov dies. They inherited property, so now they're dividing up everything. When brothers divide up an estate, ein lahem lo derech zeh. So we'll say, let's say again, so the father had certain agreements, right? Let's say with certain pathways to certain properties. those agreements do not trickle down to the kids. V'lo chalonos zalzeh, no window rights one to the other. V'lo sulamos zalzeh, from an upper story about ladder positioning, no rights like that. V'lo amas hamayim zalzeh, or the right to use certain channels of water. V'zaru bahen shalachos kavuosein, and be careful because these are halachos. So the Gemara will say, so v'Rava amar yesh lahem. So we'll say, Rava says, no, they have these rights. So we'll say, so let me tell you this outside quickly. So what's the idea over here? This is fascinating. When Reuven dies and his sons inherit his property, do the sons inherit the usage in the same way that father utilized the property? So let's say father had this estate. In this estate, what ended up happening? So he had multiple fields. So obviously, they're all owned by Reuven. So if Reuven has the right to walk from one field to another, Reuven had a channel of water, had a stream. He channeled water into the fields, across one field into another field, right? Or for that matter, he had a two-story building. He had a ladder, an entry ladder, affixed on the outside of the chutzner. So the Gemara says, now that the brothers divide up everything, the Nardaim say, those rights are not maintained. So therefore, again, I will say, when Reuven gets one field and Shimon gets another field, and they have to run water, so those rights aren't automatic. Brothers have to grant each other rights in the usage of each other's property, and we don't say that since when father was alive, there was one harmonious usage of all of this, that same level of harmonious usage trickles down to the heirs. Instead, the heirs are now considered to be like independent owners, and have to work out whatever joint usage rights they have with each other. So quite fascinating. Rava, on the other hand, disagrees. Rava Amar Yeshlan. Rava says, however the deceased father used the property, the same manner of usage passes down to the kids. It's a fascinating machlokes over here. See, Rabbosa, again, in this case over here, that's really the machlokes. So Reuven inherited the mansion. Shimon got the garden. Shimon puts up the wall. Does Reuven have the ability to go and say, listen, this is inheritance, and therefore I have the same right to use it as Dad used it? Dad used it with unobstructed daylight. That's my opportunity. Or no, once inheritance comes, it's like Panav Chadoshos Balakan, new owners, and therefore again, anything that previously existed really does not exist. So we'll say it's a fascinating and fundamental machlokes. Good, fascinating fundamental machlokes over here. It happens to be good, fine. So okay, we'll say. Good. So this again, we'll say, so that's the machlokes. That's the machlokes. So again, does Shimon have the ability to go ahead and build that wall or not? Really, the fundamental machlokes comes down to the nature of inheritance. Does an inheritor have the right to use the property in the same way that the deceased father did, or that Allah Chalamaysa, no, new ownership over here, and everyone has the right to use it as they please? Okay. Hoshtar diyasmi dinafek al. Both another interesting case. There was a shtar diyasmi. So both say, here's the case. Here is the case. There was look at Rashi. Rashi says over here, Tavra, Shover Shu Parua La'aviyam. Supposed to say, now watch this. Reuven lent Shimon $1,000. So now Reuven died. Shimon produced a receipt that halacha l'maisa, that he paid back now deceased Reuven. The Yisomim claim that the receipt was forged. Sheet is forged. That's not true. Shimon never paid back anything. So we'll say, what's the halacha? What do you do now? So now, we'll say, interestingly enough, if you go back to Rashi, Tavra, Shover Shu Parua, so fine. So the Gemara says as follows. So now, what's the halacha? Amar Rav Chama, Agvuye lo magbina le, umikra lo karina le. Rav Chama says like this. On one hand, we can't collect the debt, but nor do we tear up the receipt. So what's going on over here? So on one hand, the Yisomim can't collect the debt. Why can't they collect it? Because Shimon does have a receipt. The Gemara says, "Mikra lo karina le dechi gadli yasmi dilma maisuraya umarile." But ultimately, again, we also won't tear it up. Why? Because lemaisa, when the Yisomim grow up, they have the right to adjudicate this case, to litigate this case. So we kind of essentially go. Rav Chama says essentially we go into a holding pattern with this. Amar le Rav Acha, Reid Rav Ravina Hilchas Samai. What's the halacha? Amar le Bekulu Hilchasa Krav Chama. So we'll say. So remember again, the common denominator of all of these halachas, they were all. Now the Gemara says the halacha follows Rav Chama in all of these cases. In all of these cases, lebar mitavra, with the exception of this last case regarding the receipt. The Sadi b'shakri lo mechaskinan. Because Rabbi say we assume. Remember again, the witnesses. There are witnesses that ultimately again there are witnesses that Shimon did not pay back Ruvain. So therefore, again, Rabbi say if you have witnesses that he didn't pay back, even though again Shimon is producing a receipt, halacha l'maisa, witnesses don't lie. Marzut Rav Mari Amar Baha Nami Hilchos like Rav Chama. So it comes along Marzutra and says, no, the halacha is like Recham in this case as well. Why? Because if the receipt was a legitimate receipt, then what? Then ultimately it should have been produced during the lifetime of Ruvain. It's interesting that Shimon doesn't produce this receipt while Ruvain is alive. And he only produces the receipt once Shimon is dead. Shimon only produces the receipt once Reuven, the lender, is dead. So the Gemara says, the fact that ultimately, again, he didn't produce the receipt until after Reuven was dead seems a little bit fishy, and therefore or more than a little bit fishy, seems fraudulent, and therefore, halacha l'maisa, we assume that halacha l'maisa, we assume that the document is forged. Therefore, I will say the Gemara ends off by essentially saying that all of the cases where he quoted Rav Chama, right? All of the cases ultimately, again, halacha l'maisa, we follow like Rav Chama. So I will say we spoke about this in the earlier cases, which also sounds like I will say in the case of the wall and the mansion, since Shimon, the owner of the garden, says, "I built in my own property," because he says that is a legitimate taina, and Ruvain doesn't have the ability to object. So really, really quite interesting. So halacha l'maisa doesn't have the ability to object. As opposed to, say, in the previous case, remember in the previous wall case where the wall obstructed the windows, that was a different kind of case, because remember again, that was a partnership wall. So in a partnership wall that blocks windows, then you have an ability to object. But l'maisa, again over here, in this case where Shimon is building on his own property, Reuven has no right to object. Sefer Rabbi say again, also by extension, it sounds like that halacha l'maisa, when children inherit property, the usages and the rights of the father do not automatically trickle down to the child as well. All right, we'll say Mishnah. Let's go. Kofin also livnos beis shar v'delas l'chatzer. So we'll say a very interesting case here. So we'll say, so now we're transitioning a little bit. People who live in a chatzer together. So remember again, we know the Talmudic model. Multiple homes opening up into a joint courtyard. Shabbos says, so what's the halacha? When you are part of a chatzar, we force you to participate in certain public needs. So for example, we could force any of the residents of the chatzar to build a base shar, a gatehouse, Videlas, and a wall and a door for the chatzar. Not every chatzar needs a gatehouse. Similarly, if you live in a city, as part of a resident of a city, you have to share in the responsibilities of the city. So we could force the residents of the city to go ahead and build a wall, doors, and a crossbeam. Says, not every city needs a wall. All right, we'll say, how long do you have to live in a city until you are assessed like a member of the city? Good base 1 year. Once you're in the city for a year, you're assessed like a member of the city. Kanaba by base dira, but again, I will say if you actually purchase real estate, you buy a home in the city, then how do you ka'anshe miyad? So I will say it's interesting. If you live in a city, let's say you rent, right, or you're staying at a friend, or you're there. If you're there for 12 months, then you're a member of the city, you're assessed. If you buy property, then the moment you buy property, halacha l'maisa, you're automatically part of the city and assessed with all of its needs. Says the Gemara, the Memra. So I will say, so remember again, the first thing the Mishnah told us was that if you live in a chatzar, you are assessed and you have to pay your way as part of the chatzar needs. And amongst the things that are necessary for a chatzar is a base shar, is a gatehouse. A gatehouse. So the Gemara says, remember the base shar mal yusi? Is that to say that a gatehouse is a good thing? Supposed to look at this Gemara. Vahua chasida davaragal Eliyahu davar mishtavi bahadei. Supposed to there was a particular chassid, and Eliyahu Hanavi used to visit him every day. Incredible. Avad base shar, the guy made a gatehouse for his chatzar. Visulo mishtavi bahadei, and Eliyahu Hanavi stopped coming to him. So I said, what did he do? He created a gated community. Why did Eliyahu Hanavi stop coming? Because the gatehouse prevented aniyim, prevented the poor from coming and collecting. So the Navi says, you block out the poor, you keep out the poor, I'm not coming to visit you anymore. Lo kash it's incredible, right? If the poor can't visit with you, Eliyahu Hanavi can't visit with you. Incredible. Lo kasha, so what's going on over here? Hamigavroi, me'avroi. So it's possible that maybe it's talking about different placements of the gatehouse. One is talking about ultimately, again, a gatehouse on the inside, one is on the outside. V'bais ema, hava hame'avroi. Maybe both are on the outside. V'lo kasha, had the islay delas, had the leslay delas. One is talking about, again, when it has a door, when it doesn't have a door. If it has a door, the ani is not going to walk in. If it doesn't have a door, the ani will walk in. Ibais ema, hava had the islay delas, v'lo kasha, kasha had the isle posachas, had the letzle posachas. Or maybe both have a door. One is a doorknob, so you can access it. One doesn't have a doorknob, so you can only so you can't access it. Viba yisema had the isle posachas. Maybe both have a doorknob. But kasha had the posachas didei migavoy, had the posachas didei ma'avroi. Maybe it depends what the doorknob is. Is the doorknob on the inside, doorknob on the outside? In other words, we'll say bottom line is you can have a gatehouse, but the aniyim have to be able to access the residence of the chazar. If the aniyim can't get in and collect, it is considered to be a cruel and indifferent approach to the poor, and therefore ultimately, again, if you don't have room in your life for other Jews, especially again those who are struggling, then Eliyahu Hanavi doesn't feel the need to visit as well. So we'll stop over here for today. Sorry, I went a little bit fast on the last part. We'll pick up over here to 2 dots tomorrow. Shkoyach. All right, have a great day, everyone.